Joining us now, Democratic Senator Chris Coons of Delaware. He's a member of the Foreign Relations and Judiciary Committees. And what do you make of the incident, but also the Russian ambassador's, explanation, so to speak, of it?
Well, good morning, Mika. This is yet another incident of Russian irresponsibility, recklessness, refusal to follow international law. The United States has every right to operate a drone in international airspace in order for us to be able to monitor activity in the Black Sea and in the ongoing war of Russian aggression in Ukraine. Americans should not be helping the Russians with their explanation that the ongoing war of aggression in Ukraine is merely a territorial dispute. And as we further investigate this incident, it needs to be clear that Russia is violating international law, that the United States is standing by its partners and allies in Europe, and that we will continue to supply and support the brave Ukrainians who are fighting and dying to regain their sovereign territory.
Senator Coons, good morning. It's Jonathan Lemire. Earlier in the show, David Ignatius from the Washington Post was on with some reporting that he spoke to Pentagon officials who say clearly the fuel dump on the drone was intentional, but there's at least a suggestion that the Russian jet that clipped it, that may have been accidental and just been pilot error, and shows to their sloppiness, perhaps, of their Air Force right now. So comment on that if you know more. But regardless, it's certainly clear that the Russians are provoking. They're aggressive. What is your level of concern that they may be looking to sort of escalate this into a wider incident with the United States and NATO?
Well, we shouldn't let the Russians escalate accidentally. One of our security challenges with China is that we don't have the sort of deconfliction channels, the ability to talk to each other tactically and strategically, military to military, which we have long had with the Russians. I do think that folks here on the Hill should wait until the Pentagon's investigated and concluded whether the downing of the drone was accidental. But the larger point is this is happening in the context of intentional and willful Russian aggression against Ukraine. I do think Putin would like to see this war escalate into a broader war against the United States and NATO. At least he'd like to have that talking point. And so we should be careful and measured. We should continue to support the Ukrainians. But if it's not clear that this was an intentional incident, we should do as the Biden administration has done, summon the Russian ambassador, protest, remind the world who is the aggressor here, and continue on our current course of robust support for Ukraine.
So, Senator, given the lit fuse that is Ukraine and Russia, and given what happened over the Black Sea, do you have any sense of the communication at the top of the House, each houses? Secretary of Defense here, Defense Minister in Russia, Putin, President of the United States, any sense at all of communication that might be going on between the two of them? And then, as to your last point that you made about Ukraine, what do we do about the surrender caucus that's on the other side of the aisle from you?
Well, first, I can't share with you anything in detail this morning about what communications may or may not have happened between our most senior military and political and elected leaders. But I will say that I'm gravely concerned that we've got some significant voices in the Republican Party suggesting that this isn't a national security interest, suggesting, as the governor of Florida just did, that this is merely a territorial dispute. As you well know, Mike, a territorial dispute would be Liechtenstein in Austria going into court and saying our boundary is this side of the river versus that side of the river based on a 1600s treaty. A war is when 100,000 troops invade a neighboring country without justification, murdering civilians, occupying territory, bombing civilian infrastructure. Russia has invaded Ukraine. It is a war of aggression. And I think it is vital to the United States' national security interests for us to stand strongly with our European partners and allies in supporting Ukraine's efforts to resist Russian aggression and expel the invaders from their land.
Chris, I certainly agree that we need to be careful about characterizing this incident. I mean, I'm frankly pretty sure that nobody thinks a midair collision is the way to bring down a drone. That's more likely to cause the bringing down of the Russian jet and the death of that pilot than it is to cause any lasting impact on the American military. On the other hand, I think we have failed, and I'd love you to speak to this, in connecting the dots for the American people over what we have done to help Ukraine and what we are continuing to do. I think the fatigue that some Americans are feeling around Ukraine is that I know it's not a blank check, but the other side's going to say it's a blank check. But one of the reasons they say that is because I don't think most people understand what we have given them, what we continue to give them with more detail. Can you help with that?
Claire, as a senator who served on armed services and is well informed about exactly what we've been doing with Ukraine, I appreciate the question. In 2014, when Putin and Putin's forces invaded and occupied Crimea and parts of the Donbass in eastern Ukraine, we assessed that the Ukrainian military was not ready to fight a modern war. And the United States and some of our NATO partners and allies began providing critically needed training, National Guard to National Guard, military to military, and over the following 8 years made a dramatic and steady improvement in the ability of the Ukrainians to fight in a flexible, modern style. And when the war came, when the next phase of this invasion by Russia came in February of last year, Ukrainian soldiers showed not just incredible will and determination, but the ability to use advanced weapons, javelins and stingers, to deter what should have been, by all accounts, a successful assault on Kyiv by one of the most sophisticated militaries in the world. Ukrainian soldiers turned them back. So, Claire, we have provided tens of billions of dollars of materiel, of military equipment, of economic support, of humanitarian support. But our partners in Europe have matched much of our giving. They have welcomed millions of refugees. They've also provided military and economic support. Without all of this support, Ukraine would not be as far along as they are in expelling Russia's invasion. But without the Ukrainian will to fight, they also wouldn't be where they are. I think this is the front lines of freedom in the world today, and it is a fight that matters when we say that we stand with our European partners and allies in protecting the rule of law and in saying you can't redraw borders by force.
Senator, picking up on the last point of the last bastion of freedom, the fact that Russia and China has now tried to expand even into Africa and the Caribbean and other places, for the United States to not respond to Ukraine and the expansion of Russia would, in the long run, maybe even in the short term, threaten democracy and freedoms around the world. So do you think Americans understand what's at stake here is not just Ukraine, but the broader picture of the clear indication by Putin and others that they want to have a global confrontation between autocracy and democracy, and this is one of the fronts they fight on?
That's right, Rev. And I recently went on a bipartisan trip to southern Africa, to several countries where the impact on those countries of this war has been an increase in the prices of food and fuel. Russian disinformation, Chinese aggressive investment has left a significant footprint in a part of the world where the United States was long the preferred partner for development, for humanitarian relief, for economic opportunity. We need to be attentive to the concerns and needs of the global South, of countries that are impacted by this war in Ukraine, and to stand firmly in those parts of the world and make the case you just made, Reverend Al, that this is about giving countries options, freedom, the ability to choose their own future rather than facing aggression at the point of a gun.
All right, Senator Chris Coons, thank you very much for coming on the show this morning. We appreciate it. Now, 2 months